The snow fell in heavy silence over the Ardennes, swallowing sound, dulling movement, turning the forest into a white, endless maze. It was December 1944, in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, and for the German soldiers pushing through the frozen woods, every step felt heavier than the last. Their boots crunched against ice-hidden roots, their breath hung in the air, and their supplies, what little remained, were stretched thin. Hunger wasn't just a discomfort anymore, it was a constant companion. The offensive had begun with confidence, surprise was on their side, and for a brief moment it seemed like the tide could turn. But now, deep in the forest, that confidence was fading. The cold was relentless, fuel was scarce, food even scarcer. And yet orders were orders, advance, always advance. A small group of German infantry moved cautiously between the trees, rifles ready, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The Americans were out there somewhere, hidden, waiting. The forest played tricks on the mind. Shadows looked like soldiers. Wind through branches sounded like whispers. Every abandoned object could be bait. Then one of them spotted something unusual. Half buried in the snow, just off a narrow forest path, was a canvas bag, olive drab, distinctly American. It didn't belong there, not untouched, not intact. The soldier raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. Instantly, the group froze. No one spoke. They didn't need to. It could be anything. A trap, a signal, a distraction. One soldier slowly stepped forward, his boots sinking into the snow with each careful movement. His rifle remained trained on the bag, as if it might move on its own. Another soldier scanned the trees, watching for the slightest flicker of motion. The Americans were known for clever tactics. Leaving something behind like this, it wasn't normal. The man crouched down, hesitating for a moment before reaching out. Even through his gloves, his fingers felt stiff, slow. He paused again, listening. Nothing, just the wind. Carefully, he nudged the bag with the barrel of his rifle. Still nothing. He glanced back at his comrades. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, with a deep breath, he grabbed the bag and pulled it free from the snow. It was heavier than expected. That alone was strange. If it had been discarded in a hurry, it should have been empty, or at least partially used. But this felt intact, full. The soldier frowned, his suspicion growing. He slowly opened the flap, his movements deliberate, almost reluctant, as if expecting something to explode or trigger at any second. But instead of danger, he found something else entirely. Food. Not scraps, not leftovers, not the kind of desperate, improvised rations he and his fellow soldiers had grown used to. This was something different. He reached inside and pulled out a neatly packaged item, staring at it in disbelief. Then another, and another. Chocolate, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, even chewing gum. For a moment, no one spoke. The forest, the war, the cold, it all seemed to fade into the background as the soldiers gathered closer, their eyes fixed on the contents of the bag. This wasn't just food, this was abundance. One of the soldiers let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. Another shook his head slowly. They had seen shortages for months now, supplies cut, replacements delayed, rations reduced. Many of them had been surviving on substitutes, ersatz bread, thin soups, whatever could be scraped together. And yet here, in the middle of a frozen battlefield, lay a simple American ration bag, filled with items they could barely imagine having regularly. It didn't make sense. Why would soldiers at the front carry this much? Why would it be left behind? Was it truly abandoned, or was it meant to be found? The suspicion didn't disappear. If anything, it deepened, because this bag told a story. Not just about one soldier who dropped it, not just about carelessness or chance. It hinted at something much larger, something far more unsettling.
If this was what a single American soldier carried into battle, then what did that say about the army behind him? The men exchanged glances, their earlier tension replaced by something quieter, heavier, doubt. Not about the bag, but about the war itself. One soldier unwrapped the chocolate slowly, almost cautiously, as if it might vanish. He took a small bite, savoring it despite himself. It was rich, real, nothing like the substitutes he had grown used to. Another lit one of the cigarettes, inhaling deeply, his eyes closing for just a second longer than necessary. For a brief moment, they weren't soldiers in a freezing forest. They were just men, reminded of a world that felt impossibly far away. But the moment didn't last, because the question lingered, unspoken but undeniable. If the enemy could afford this, if they could supply their soldiers with not just the basics, but comfort, consistency, even small luxuries, then what else could they afford? The forest grew silent again as the reality began to settle in. This wasn't just a bag, it was a message. And whether it was left intentionally or not, the message was clear.
The bag passed from hand to hand, each soldier examining its contents with a mixture of disbelief and unease. What they had first approached with suspicion now held their full attention, not because it was dangerous, but because it made no sense. One of them pulled out a small cardboard box, its design clean, precise, almost factory perfect. He turned it over in his hands, reading the English text slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar words. Inside, everything was carefully arranged, nothing wasted, nothing improvised. This was not the kind of ration they knew. German field rations had changed as the war dragged on. Early on, they had been adequate, simple but reliable. But now, months into shortages and strained supply lines, things were different. Bread stretched with substitutes, coffee replaced with bitter imitations, meat, when available, often canned and scarce. Every item felt like it had been reduced, adjusted, compromised. But this was something else entirely. Another soldier reached into the bag and pulled out a chocolate bar, still perfectly wrapped. He stared at it for a moment before giving a dry, almost humorless smile. Chocolate wasn't unheard of, but to see it here, in such condition, untouched, felt surreal. He broke off a small piece and tasted it. For a second he said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly, as if the flavor alone carried a kind of weight. It wasn't just sweet, it was rich, solid, unmistakably real. Not a substitute, not a replacement. The kind of chocolate that reminded you of home, of normal life. Around him, the others watched closely. Another man found packets of sugar, neatly sealed. He shook his head in quiet disbelief. Sugar had become a luxury, something rationed, measured carefully, almost guarded. And yet here it was, packed in individual portions, as if there was no concern about running out. Then came the coffee. Not a weak imitation, not a desperate substitute, but real coffee. The smell alone, even before preparation, was enough to draw attention. One of the soldiers held it closer, inhaling deeply, his expression shifting, just for a moment, from hardened focus to something softer, more distant. And then the chocolate. Those, perhaps more than anything, created a strange silence among them. Chocolate weren't just habit, they were currency, comfort, a brief escape from the cold, from fear, from the endless waiting. And here they were, included as part of a standard ration. Standard. That word lingered, because that was the most unsettling part. This wasn't special, this wasn't rare. This wasn't an officer's supply or some kind of luxury item sent to boost morale for a select few. This was what an average American soldier carried. An average soldier. One of the Germans let out a quiet breath, almost a whisper. He looked at the others, then back at the contents of the bag. "How many of them have this?" he muttered.
No one answered, because they were all thinking the same thing. If this was normal, if this was standard issue, then the scale of it was difficult to comprehend. It meant factories somewhere far from this frozen forest were producing these items in massive quantities, packaging them, shipping them across an ocean, delivering them reliably to the front lines. Even here, even in the middle of winter, even during an offensive. The realization didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like the cold itself, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. One of them picked up a piece of chewing gum, turning it over curiously before unwrapping it. He hesitated, then placed it in his mouth. His expression shifted almost immediately, surprise flickering across his face. Chewing gum. Such a small thing, almost trivial, and yet in this moment it felt significant. Because it wasn't necessary, it wasn't survival, it was comfort, it was morale. It was a reminder that someone, somewhere, had thought beyond just keeping soldiers alive. They had thought about keeping them functioning, steady, even distracted from the stress of war. The Germans exchanged glances again, but this time the feeling was different. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was comparison. Unavoidable, silent comparison. Their own rations had become thinner over time, less reliable, more unpredictable, deliveries delayed, quantities reduced, quality sacrificed. Every man knew it, even if no one said it out loud. But this bag, this single bag, told a different story. A story of consistency, of planning, of resources that didn't seem to run out. One of them carefully placed the items back into the bag, almost respectfully now. The suspicion from earlier hadn't completely disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer about traps or ambushes. It was about understanding something far more unsettling. This wasn't luck. This wasn't an accident. This was system. And systems like this didn't exist without power behind them. As the group prepared to move again, the forest seemed colder than before, heavier. The snow still fell, the trees still stood silent, but something had shifted. They had come looking for the enemy. Instead, they had found a glimpse of something much larger, and it left them with a question that lingered long after they moved on. Not just what the Americans were carrying, but how much more they had that no one could see.
At first, it was just a bag, just food, something unusual, maybe even unsettling, but still small, still local, still explainable. But as the soldiers continued moving through the frozen forest, that simple discovery refused to leave their minds. It lingered in the background of every step, every breath of cold air, every quiet glance exchanged between them. Because the more they thought about it, the less it felt like a coincidence. One of them finally broke the silence, his voice low, almost reluctant. This didn't come from here. It was obvious, and yet it needed to be said. Nothing about that ration bag belonged to this forest, to this moment, to this kind of war. It hadn't been improvised. It hadn't been assembled under pressure. It had been designed, produced, packaged with precision. And that meant something far beyond the battlefield. The soldiers knew what it took to supply an army. They lived it every day. The delays, the shortages, the uncertainty. Trucks that never arrived, trains that were rerouted or destroyed, supplies that had to be stretched, replaced, or simply done without. War, as they experienced it, was constant adaptation. But what they had seen in that bag suggested something entirely different: consistency. Somewhere, far from the front lines, there had to be factories, massive ones, producing identical rations in enormous quantities. Not just food, but complete, carefully measured packages, each one the same, each one reliable. Chocolate didn't just appear in the middle of winter. Coffee didn't travel across continents by accident. Cigarettes weren't included without reason. There was a system behind it, a machine that didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't seem affected by the same pressures crushing everything else. One soldier imagined it for a moment. Rows of machines, endless lines of workers, crates being filled, sealed, and shipped out one after another, trains moving on schedule, ships crossing oceans without interruption, supplies flowing constantly, steadily. It was difficult to picture because it was so different from what they knew. Their own supply lines had become fragile, stretched thin across too many fronts. Fuel shortages limited movement, bombing raids disrupted production. Even when supplies existed, getting them to the right place at the right time had become a challenge. Every delivery felt uncertain, every ration felt temporary. But that American bag suggested the opposite. It suggested control, not just over resources, but over time, distance, and coordination. Another soldier spoke, quieter this time. If they can give this to every man, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because the implication was already clear. If this level of supply was standard, then the scale behind it had to be enormous. It meant reserves, it meant surplus, it meant an ability to replace losses, to sustain pressure, to keep going long after others began to run out. And that changed things. Not immediately, not in a way that could be measured on a map or in a report, but in the mind, in the way a soldier understood the war around him. Until now, the fight had been about terrain, about tactics, about timing, gains and losses measured in kilometers, victories and defeats decided by movement and firepower. But this was something deeper, something slower, but far more powerful. Because no matter how well an attack was planned, no matter how skilled the soldiers were, none of it mattered without support, without food, without fuel, without the constant flow of supplies that kept everything moving. And suddenly, that flow didn't seem equal. The forest closed in around them as they marched, the snow still falling, the air still biting. But now there was a new weight pressing down. Not just exhaustion, not just hunger, but awareness. Awareness that somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of artillery and rifles, there was an advantage that couldn't be easily countered. One soldier tightened his grip on his weapon, his jaw set. "This is not just about fighting," he said quietly. Again, no one responded, because they all understood. The war wasn't only being decided here in the frozen woods, in brief clashes and sudden ambushes. It was being decided in places they would never see: factories, railways, ports, in the ability to produce, to organize, to deliver without failure. The ration bag had made that visible, not through orders, not through intelligence reports, but through something simple, something undeniable. As they continued forward, the sound of distant artillery rolled faintly through the forest, a reminder that the battle was still very real, still immediate. But now, beneath that sound, there was another thought, quieter but far more persistent, a question that no one wanted to ask out loud. If the enemy's strength came not just from weapons, but from an entire system that never seemed to break, then how do you fight something like that? The snow kept falling, and for the first time, it didn't just feel cold. It felt final.
By the time they moved deeper into the Ardennes, the initial momentum of the offensive had begun to fade. What had started as a bold, confident push was now slowing under the weight of reality. The forest was no longer just an obstacle. It had become a barrier, a silent witness to everything that was beginning to go wrong. The men felt it before they fully understood it. Fuel was becoming harder to find. Vehicles stood abandoned along narrow roads, engines silent, their usefulness ended not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. Supply trucks arrived late, or not at all. Ammunition had to be conserved. Food, already scarce, was stretched thinner with each passing day. None of this was new. But now, after what they had seen, it felt different. because the contrast was impossible to ignore. One soldier glanced back down the path they had taken, as if expecting to see something following them. Not the enemy, but the thought itself. That bag, those rations, that quiet, unsettling realization that somewhere the Americans were not dealing with the same problems. They didn't need to say it out loud. Everyone already knew. The plan had depended on speed, on breaking through quickly, capturing fuel, disrupting enemy lines before they could respond. But speed required coordination, and coordination required resources, and resources were exactly what they were beginning to lack. Another unit passed them on the road, tired, silent, faces drawn tight from cold and exhaustion. One of the men muttered something about delays ahead. Bridges destroyed, resistance stronger than expected. Nothing was moving the way it was supposed to. The cracks were there, and they were spreading. A sergeant in the group adjusted his gloves, his movements slower than before. He had seen enough campaigns to recognize the signs. Not defeat, not yet, but strain, the kind that builds quietly, almost invisibly, until it can no longer be hidden. "This is not how it was meant to go," he said under his breath. No one argued, because the signs were everywhere. Maps no longer matched reality. Timetables slipped. Orders changed. Communication grew uncertain. Every small disruption added to the next, creating a chain of problems that no single action could fix. And behind it all was something even more difficult to confront. They were running out. Not just of food, not just of fuel, of certainty. The idea that this offensive could turn the war, that it could shift the balance, was beginning to feel distant, not impossible, but fragile, dependent on too many things going right in a situation where too many things were already going wrong. One of the younger soldiers spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "Why aren't we getting what we need?" It was a simple question, but it didn't have a simple answer, because the truth wasn't just about one missing delivery or one delayed convoy. It was bigger than that. It was about a system under pressure, a system that could no longer keep up with the demands placed on it. Factories struggling under constant bombing, transport lines stretched across multiple fronts, fuel reserves dwindling faster than they could be replaced, each piece connected to the next, and when one failed, the others followed. The sergeant who had carried the American ration bag earlier shifted it slightly on his shoulder. He hadn't meant to keep it, but no one had told him to leave it behind. Now it felt heavier than before, not because of its contents, but because of what it represented. He thought about the items inside again: chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, things that were never meant to decide a battle. And yet, somehow, they did, because they spoke of something deeper: reliability, consistency, confidence that tomorrow's supply would arrive just like today's. That was something they no longer had. A distant explosion echoed through the trees, followed by the low rumble of artillery. The war was still moving, still active, still dangerous, but now there was a growing sense that it wasn't moving in their favor, not in the long run. The sergeant looked ahead, his expression hardening. "We keep moving," he said firmly. It was the only option, because stopping wasn't possible. But as they pushed forward once more, there was a subtle change in the way they carried themselves. Less certainty, more weight in every step. The forest, once just cold and silent, now felt heavier with meaning. Not just a place of battle, but a place where something had become clear. The enemy wasn't just ahead of them. It was ahead of them in ways they couldn't easily catch up to. And for the first time, that realization didn't feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something irreversible.
By the final days of the offensive, the forest no longer felt like a place of opportunity. It felt like a trap that had slowly closed in around them. The snow still covered everything, hiding the scars of battle beneath a quiet, almost indifferent surface,
But the illusion was gone. The advance had stalled. What remained now was endurance. The soldiers moved more slowly, their energy drained not just by the cold, but by the growing understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The confidence that had carried them forward at the beginning was no longer there. In its place was something quieter, heavier, acceptance, though few of them would have called it that. The fighting continued, of course. Orders were still given, positions were still taken and lost, but beneath all of it there was a deeper realization forming, one that had nothing to do with a single battle or a single decision. It had been there from the moment they opened that ration bag. One soldier, the same one who had first tasted the chocolate, walked in silence, his thoughts distant. He hadn't forgotten the taste, not because it was extraordinary, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just food, it was certainty, and that was something they no longer had. Around him, the signs were impossible to ignore now. Units were pulling back, vehicles abandoned not by choice, but by necessity. Supplies that didn't arrive, reinforcements that came too late, were not at all. Every delay, every shortage, every small failure had added up, not suddenly, but steadily, and that was the difference. Battles could be lost in hours, positions could fall in minutes, but this kind of failure took time. It grew quietly, beneath the surface, until it reached a point where it could no longer be reversed. The soldier adjusted his grip on his weapon, his fingers numb from the cold. He looked around at the others, faces worn, movement slower, eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. No one needed to say it, they all felt it. This was no longer about winning ground, it was about holding on, and even that was becoming uncertain. Far above them, hidden beyond the clouds, the world continued to move. Factories kept running, trains kept moving, ships kept crossing oceans, systems that had nothing to do with this forest and yet controlled everything that happened within it. That was the part that couldn't be fought, not with rifles, not with tactics, not with courage alone. Because no matter how hard they pushed, no matter how well they fought, they couldn't replace what was missing. They couldn't create fuel out of nothing. They couldn't produce supplies in the middle of a frozen battlefield. They couldn't match an enemy whose strength came from something constant, something stable, something far beyond reach. The ration bag had revealed that, not as a moment of shock, but as a quiet truth, one that only became clearer with time. The soldier finally stopped for a brief moment, looking out over the snow-covered trees. Everything looked the same as before, the same cold, the same silence, the same endless forest. And yet, everything had changed, because now he understood something he hadn't before. The war wasn't being decided here, not entirely. It was being decided far away, in places that didn't freeze, didn't starve, didn't break under pressure, in systems that kept producing, kept supplying, kept moving forward no matter what happened on the front lines. And against that, there was no easy answer. He reached into his coat and pulled out one last item from the American ration he had kept, a stick of chewing gum. For a moment, he simply looked at it, turning it in his fingers. Such a small, insignificant thing, easy to ignore, easy to dismiss, but now it felt like something else entirely, a symbol, not of luxury, but of capacity, of a nation that could afford to think beyond survival, even in the middle of war. He unwrapped it slowly and placed it in his mouth, the motion almost automatic. Around him, the others continued moving, their figures fading slightly into the falling snow. The taste was simple, sweet, unremarkable, and yet it carried a meaning that was impossible to ignore, because it wasn't about the gum, it was about everything behind it.
The soldier exhaled, his breath disappearing into the cold air as quickly as it formed. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and continued on. The forest remained silent. The war continued, but the outcome no longer felt uncertain. Not after what they had seen, not after what they had understood, and all of it had started with a single ration bag in the snow.